June 19, 1944. 1,036 hours. 90 miles west of Guam. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, perched in the cockpit of his F-6F Hellcat at 25,000 feet, watched something that would redefine naval aviation forever. Through the crystalline Pacific sky, he counted them, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft, so many that they darkened the horizon like a swarm of locusts. What happened in the next 8 hours wouldn't just be a battle. It would be an execution. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese would call it Dai-nana Kōkū Kantai no Saigo, the end of the 7th Air Fleet. This wasn't just about superior aircraft or better pilots. This was about a systematic technological and tactical revolution that had been building since Pearl Harbor, culminating in a single day when Japan's naval aviation died burning in the Pacific sky. The seeds of Japan's aerial destruction were planted 18 months before the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, in the aftermath of their Pyrrhic victory at the Battle of the Philippine Sea's predecessor engagements. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, had been studying every carrier engagement since Midway with growing alarm. He reached a conclusion that contradicted everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had believed about carrier warfare since Pearl Harbor. American naval aviation had fundamentally transformed. In his flagship Taiho, the newest and most advanced carrier in the Japanese fleet, Ozawa drafted what would become known as Operation Saigo. The plan assumed Japanese advantages that had ceased to exist: superior pilot training, longer-range aircraft, and the element of tactical surprise. But by June 1944, every single one of these assumptions had become a fatal delusion. The mathematics of aerial combat had shifted catastrophically against Japan. At Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese carrier pilots had fought American opponents to roughly equal terms: skilled aviators on both sides, comparable aircraft, similar tactical doctrines. At Midway 1 month later, Japan lost 4 carriers, but their surviving pilots remained among the world's best, veterans with 800-plus hours of flight training and combat experience stretching back to China in 1937. But the Americans had been building something unprecedented, an industrial training pipeline that treated pilots like manufactured products, created through standardized processes at massive scale. By June 1944, the United States was producing 100,000 pilots annually. Japan's entire aviation training infrastructure could barely produce 5,000 per year, and that number was falling as fuel shortages and American submarine warfare strangled their training programs. The quality differential had become equally devastating. American naval aviators arriving at carriers in 1944 had logged 300-plus flight hours, with 50-plus hours in their specific aircraft type. Japanese pilots arriving at Ozawa's carriers averaged 100 total flight hours, barely enough to land on a carrier deck in calm seas, much less fight aerial combat against battle-hardened Americans. The Japanese training catastrophe traced directly to their early successes. In 1941-42, Japan's naval aviation operated under the philosophy of Saishin Ryoku, spiritual power through elite training. Pilot candidates underwent 3 years of brutal selection, emerging as superbly skilled aviators. But this system was designed for peacetime, producing perhaps 300 to 400 pilots annually. When those irreplaceable veterans began dying at Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal, Japan had no system to replace them at scale. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi Sadamu, the air staff officer for the combined fleet, documented this crisis in reports that have survived in Japanese archives. In March 1944, he wrote, "Our pilot quality has deteriorated beyond recognition. Men who would have been rejected as untrainable in 1941 now fly combat missions after minimal preparation. They cannot navigate, cannot execute coordinated attacks, and panic under fire. We are sending children to fight professionals." The technological imbalance had grown equally catastrophic. Japan's frontline fighter in June 1944 remained a Mitsubishi Is-6M0, essentially the same aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies in 1941-42. The Zero's advantages of extreme range and maneuverability came at a cost that had seemed acceptable when fighting inferior opponents: no armor protection, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal armament. Against the new generation of American fighters, these deficiencies had become death sentences. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, introduced in 1943, had been designed specifically to kill Zeros. It carried 6.50 caliber machine guns versus the Zero's two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns. It had armor plating protecting the pilot and self-sealing tanks that could absorb punishment. Most critically, it had a Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine producing 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Zero's 1,130 horsepower Nakajima Sakai engine. The performance gap was measurable and deadly. The Hellcat could dive at 400 plus mph where the Zero's lightweight construction became dangerous above 350 miles per hour. In a dive, American pilots could always escape. In a climb, the Hellcat's power-to-weight ratio gave it authority the Zero couldn't match. The only advantage remaining to the Zero was turning radius, but American tactical doctrine had evolved to negate even this: never dogfight a Zero. Use speed and altitude. Dive, shoot, extend. What the Japanese couldn't know, was that the Americans had deployed a technological advantage so overwhelming that the battle was essentially over before the first shot was fired. The revolution wasn't just in aircraft, it was in something invisible, something that would allow American fighters to see the enemy before the enemy could see them, to coordinate attacks with precision that seemed almost supernatural, and to direct the entire aerial battle like a conductor leading an orchestra. Radio technology and tactical coordination had evolved into an American weapon system that Japan had no counter for. On the evening of June 18, 1944, aboard the carrier USS Lexington, Commander Paul Buey gathered the fighter direction officers for what would be their final briefing before battle. The room contained technology that represented the cutting edge of naval warfare. The SK Air Search Radar with its distinctive bedspring antenna could detect aircraft formations at 100+ miles. The SM Height Finding Radar could determine enemy altitude with precision. The Combat Information Center, a darkened room filled with plotting boards, radar displays, and radio equipment, had evolved into the brain of American carrier operations. This was the invisible battlefield where American superiority was most absolute. Fighter direction officers, specially trained personnel who could track dozens of aircraft simultaneously, would control the aerial battle from below decks. They could vector fighters toward enemy formations with precision, stack combat air patrols at optimal altitudes, and coordinate attacks involving hundreds of aircraft without visual contact. The Japanese had radar, but they had never developed the tactical doctrine, the trained personnel, or the integrated systems to use it effectively. Their fighter direction remained primitive. Pilots launched, flew predetermined patrol patterns, and hoped to spot the enemy visually. The concept of centralized control, of directing fighters toward contacts detected by ship-based radar, had never been implemented in Japanese carrier doctrine. The American technological advantage extended into every aspect of aerial combat. VT proximity fuses, radar-detonated anti-aircraft shells that exploded when near aircraft rather than requiring direct hits, had been deployed to the Pacific Fleet in early 1944. The Japanese had no knowledge of this technology. Their anti-aircraft doctrine assumed shells must directly impact aircraft or detonate at preset altitudes. The new American shells created lethal blast radii of 30 to 70 feet around any aircraft, multiplying the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire by factors of 5 or more. American aircraft carried VHF radio systems that were compact, reliable, and clear. Pilots could communicate across entire task forces, coordinating attacks in real time. Japanese radios were bulky, unreliable, often inaudible over engine noise. Japanese pilots frequently resorted to hand signals or simply attacking independently because radio coordination was impossible. Even navigation had become an American advantage. Task Force 58's carriers employed LORAN, long-range navigation, a radio-based positioning system that provided accurate location data hundreds of miles from land. Japanese navigation relied on dead reckoning and celestial navigation, methods that worked perfectly until cloud cover or combat stress intervened. American pilots could find their carriers in darkness or weather that would leave Japanese aviators lost and fuel exhausted. The night before the battle, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, reviewed intelligence assessments that revealed Japanese weaknesses with crystalline clarity. American submarines had been tracking Ozawa's mobile fleet for days, providing precise position reports. Signals intelligence had partially decoded Japanese communications, revealing their operational plans. Photo reconnaissance had mapped Japanese air bases across the Marianas, identifying aircraft types and numbers with precision. The Japanese possessed none of this intelligence infrastructure. They knew approximately where American carriers were, somewhere east of the Marianas, but had no precise locations, no detailed knowledge of American strength, no decoded communications revealing American intentions. They were fighting blind against an enemy who could see everything. In the Japanese carrier Shokaku, Lieutenant Zenji Abe prepared his Zero fighter with growing foreboding. He was among the most experienced pilots remaining in the mobile fleet, with 400 hours of flight time and combat experience at Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. But he had watched the quality of his fellow pilots deteriorate steadily. The young aviators arriving as replacements could barely perform formation flying. Some had never dropped a bomb or torpedo on a moving target. Some had never fired their guns except in training. June 19, 1944. 0830 hours. The killing began not with aerial combat, but with American submarines executing a mission that would cripple Japanese carrier operations before a single aircraft engaged. USS Albacore, patrolling west of the Marianas, achieved sonar contact on a large surface vessel at 0800 hours. Commander James Blanchard maneuvered to attack position and at 0809 fired 6 torpedoes at the contact. One torpedo struck the Japanese carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship and the newest, most advanced carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The torpedo damage seemed manageable initially. Taiho's damage control teams contained the flooding, and the carrier maintained formation. But a catastrophic mistake was about to unfold. A young, inexperienced damage control officer ordered the ship's ventilation systems activated to clear aviation gas fumes from the hangar decks. Instead of venting the fumes overboard, the ventilation system distributed them throughout the ship. At 1532 hours, 7 hours after the torpedo hit, a single spark, never definitively identified, ignited the fuel vapor that had saturated Taiho. The explosion was catastrophic. The armored flight deck, designed to withstand bombs, lifted and buckled from the internal pressure. Secondary explosions tore through the hangar deck as fueled and armed aircraft detonated. Within minutes, the newest carrier in the Japanese fleet was a burning wreck. At 1628 hours, Ozawa transferred his flag to the cruiser Haguro. At 1732 hours, Taiho rolled over and sank, taking 1,650 men with her. 60 miles to the south, USS Kavala was tracking another carrier. At 1120 hours, Commander Herman Kostler fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and every major carrier battle of the Pacific War. 4 torpedoes struck home. Like Taiho, Shokaku's damage seemed survivable initially. But aviation fuel leaks and poor damage control created the same deadly conditions. At 1401 hours, massive internal explosions ripped through the carrier. At 1410 hours, she capsized and sank, taking 1,263 men to the bottom. The Japanese had lost 2 fleet carriers and their most experienced air groups before the aerial battle even began. But worse was coming. At 1,000 hours, American radar operators aboard Lexington detected the first Japanese raid, 69 aircraft inbound at 130 miles distance. The fighter direction officer, Lieutenant Joseph Eggert, began directing the aerial response with mechanical precision. Vector 270, Angels 20. Large raid inbound. All Hellcats, prepare to engage. The Hellcats climbed to intercept with every advantage, altitude, position, and complete tactical awareness of enemy location and strength. The Japanese, flying without radar warning, without knowledge of what awaited them, continued their approach in tight formations that would have been impressive in 1941 but were suicidal in 1944. At 1,036 hours, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, leading the Essex Air Group, spotted the Japanese formation below him, Zeros, Vals, and Kates in parade ground precision. Tally-ho! Enemy aircraft, 2 o'clock low. McCampbell's Hellcats rolled into their attack dives, building speed to 400 plus mph, energy that could be converted to maneuverability or used to disengage at will. The Japanese never saw them coming. The first indication of American presence was tracers tearing through their formations. Zeros exploded under the concentrated firepower of 6.50 caliber guns converging at 1,000 feet. Vals, already obsolete dive bombers with fixed landing gear, fell like clay pigeons. The Japanese formation disintegrated not into dogfights but into a running massacre as individual aircraft tried desperately to escape attackers they couldn't outrun, outclimb, or outdive. Those Japanese aircraft that survived the fighter interception encountered something they had never experienced: proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Shells that had to directly hit aircraft in previous battles now only needed to pass within 70 feet. The sky filled with black bursts that seemed to track aircraft, detonating at precisely the right moment to shower them with shrapnel. Japanese pilots, conditioned to dodge conventional flak by changing altitude, found that no evasion worked against shells that exploded based on proximity rather than timing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese raid, only 27 survived to approach the American fleet. Of those 27, anti-aircraft fire claimed 20 more. 7 aircraft, 5 Zeros and 2 Judy dive bombers, survived to attack. They scored no hits. Not a single bomb struck an American ship. The entire raid resulted in 0 damage to Task Force 58 while costing Japan 62 aircraft and, more critically, 62 pilots who could never be replaced. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, flying in the first raid, watched his squadron disintegrate around him. The Americans attacked from above with speed that made evasion impossible. His wingman exploded in a ball of fire before Abe even saw the Hellcat that killed him. Abe threw his Zero into desperate maneuvers, using every trick learned in 3 years of combat. He survived by diving away at maximum speed, his Zero shaking violently as it approached its structural limits, pursuing Hellcats breaking off as he descended below 1,000 feet. He returned to the carrier Zuikaku alone, the only survivor from his 12-plane section. During debriefing, he reported what he had witnessed: the Americans have become something we did not anticipate. Their pilots fight with machine precision. Their aircraft have power we cannot match. Our formations were destroyed before we could engage. This is not aerial combat as we have known it. This is execution. But Ozawa, operating from the cruiser Haguro after losing Taiho, could not accept the magnitude of the disaster unfolding. At 1,130 hours, he launched the second raid, 130 aircraft, the largest strike he could assemble. These pilots were even less experienced than the first wave, many were flying their first combat mission. They had practiced formation flying and basic attacks against stationary targets. None had experienced combat against American fighters equipped with tactical radar direction. The American radar detected them at 1,146 hours, 110 miles out. Fighter direction officers had 40 minutes to position Hellcats for optimal interception. The combat air patrol, already vectored to altitude and position, waited with the patience of predators who knew their prey was approaching blindly. Commander Charles Brewer, leading a division of Hellcats from USS Bunker Hill, described the engagement in his after-action report: contacted enemy formation at 1,215 hours, altitude 18,000 feet. Enemy aircraft in tight V formations, no combat spread, no weaving sections. We attacked from 6 o'clock high, 400 knots indicated. First burst destroyed lead 0. Formation did not break, continued straight and level for approximately 10 seconds before scattering. Engaged targets of opportunity. Expended all ammunition in 4 minutes. Confirmed 7 destroyed. Returned to carrier to rearm. The clinical precision of Brewer's report concealed the one-sided slaughter that characterized every engagement. The Japanese flew in formations designed for parade ground precision, making them perfect targets. When attacked, they scattered into individual dogfights, exactly what American doctrine had trained pilots to avoid against Zeros in 1942, but in 1944, even turning fights favored the Hellcat's superior power and armament. The second raid lost 97 aircraft before reaching the American fleet. The survivors faced the same impenetrable anti-aircraft barrage that had devastated the first raid. Proximity-fused shells created a wall of explosions that no amount of courage could penetrate. Of 130 aircraft launched, fewer than 30 returned to their carriers. They had damaged one battleship. South Dakota took a single bomb hit that killed 27 men but left the ship operational. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the horror of the losses was becoming undeniable. Returning pilots reported American fighters in numbers that seemed impossible, coordinated attacks that appeared almost telepathic in their precision, anti-aircraft fire that seemed to track individual aircraft. Some pilots, their nerves shattered, claimed American fighters had appeared from nowhere, as if invisible until the moment they attacked. The reality was simpler and more devastating. The Americans could see everything through radar, coordinate everything through radio, and execute attacks with pilots who had been trained to industrial standards of competency. The Japanese were flying blind, communicating through hand signals, executing tactics learned from instructors who themselves had minimal combat experience. At 1,300 hours, Ozawa launched a third raid. 47 aircraft, scraped together from his remaining strength. He divided them into 2 groups, hoping to saturate American defenses through multiple approach vectors. The tactic might have worked in 1942. In 1944, American radar tracked both groups from the moment they launched, vector plotting their courses, calculating intercept points, directing fighters to optimal positions. The third raid achieved even less than its predecessors. Hellcats, now rearmed and refueled from earlier engagements, intercepted both groups simultaneously. The Americans had learned to conserve ammunition, firing short, precise bursts rather than the long streams of tracers that had characterized early war combat. Each Hellcat carried 2,400 rounds, 400 rounds per gun. Experienced pilots could destroy 6 to 8 aircraft before running dry if they fired with discipline. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrashu, flying from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes during the third raid. His combat report noted, attacked Judy dive bombers in formation. First target destroyed with 2-second burst. Second target destroyed with 3-second burst. Continued engaging targets until ammunition exhausted. Enemy aircraft did not take evasive action until fired upon. No return fire experienced. Vrashu's experience was typical. Japanese pilots, inadequately trained in evasive maneuvers, flew straight courses that made them perfect targets. When they did attempt evasion, their maneuvers were textbook standard, easily anticipated by American pilots who had been trained against instructors deliberately flying like Japanese fighters. The third raid was annihilated. Of 47 aircraft, only 9 returned to their carriers. They reported no hits on American ships. In 3 raids, Ozawa had launched 246 aircraft. Fewer than 70 returned. The mobile fleet's striking power had been effectively destroyed in less than 4 hours. As the afternoon sun slanted across the Pacific, the full magnitude of the technological and tactical gulf between the 2 fleets became undeniable. The Americans hadn't just won air superiority, they had achieved something approaching air supremacy, a condition where enemy aircraft could be destroyed almost at will while American losses remained minimal. The numbers told a story of systematic slaughter. American fighters had shot down over 240 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 Hellcats. The exchange ratio exceeded 8-to-1, and many American losses were operational, aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire from their own fleet, mechanical failures, or landing accidents. Direct combat losses from Japanese fighters were fewer than a dozen. But the numbers alone couldn't convey the complete picture of American technological dominance. Every system aboard American carriers had been optimized for sustained combat operations in ways the Japanese had never achieved. Damage control parties could repair battle damage and return aircraft to service in hours. Fueling and arming systems could turn around an entire air group in 45 minutes. The Americans could sustain high-tempo operations indefinitely while Japanese carriers required hours to prepare for each strike. The American advantage extended to pilot recovery. Task Force 58 deployed destroyers specifically configured for pilot rescue, equipped with specialized gear and trained crews. Submarine lifeguard stations had been established along probable flight paths. Float planes from cruisers and battleships flew search patterns to locate downed aviators. American pilots knew that ditching near the fleet meant probable rescue. This knowledge allowed them to take risks that Japanese pilots, who knew that ditching meant almost certain death, could not afford. Japanese pilot recovery was primitive by comparison. Carriers occasionally deployed float planes, but coordination was poor, search patterns inefficient. Many pilots who survived being shot down died of exposure or drowning because no one came looking for them. This wasn't cruelty, it was simply that Japan had never developed the infrastructure, the doctrine, or the resources for effective pilot rescue. The technological gap extended even to something as basic as pilot equipment. American aviators flew with inflatable life rafts, dye markers, emergency radios, and comprehensive survival kits. Japanese pilots carried minimal emergency equipment, often just a life vest and a bottle of water. When American pilots ditched, they activated emergency beacons that allowed rescue forces to locate them within hours. Japanese pilots who ditched simply disappeared. Communications technology had created perhaps the most decisive advantage. The Americans could coordinate strikes involving 200-plus aircraft from multiple carriers, with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers all arriving at the target simultaneously from different altitudes and approach vectors. Each aircraft type knew exactly where the others would be, what targets they would attack, and when to begin their runs. This level of coordination was possible only through reliable radio communication and standardized tactical procedures practiced until they became automatic. Japanese coordination relied on visual signals, waggling wings, firing flares, or simply hoping everyone understood the plan discussed in briefings. When formations scattered under attack, which happened within seconds of encountering American fighters, all coordination collapsed. Aircraft attacked independently, often getting in each other's way, duplicating efforts on some targets while ignoring others. The Hellcat itself represented a philosophy of aircraft design that Japan had never embraced, pilot survivability as a design priority. The aircraft carried armor plating protecting the pilot from behind and below, the directions from which most attacks came. The self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple hits without catching fire. The robust construction could withstand battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Hellcats regularly returned to carriers with dozens of bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, or failed engines, and their pilots walked away. Zeros had none of these protections. A single .50 caliber round striking the fuel tank meant fire and probable death. The lightweight construction that gave the Zero its maneuverability also meant that battle damage was often catastrophic. Structural failures were common when aircraft pulled high-G maneuvers while damaged. Japanese pilots flew aircraft that gave them marginal performance advantages but offered almost no protection if they were hit. Admiral Ozawa, aboard Haguro, reviewed the afternoon's disaster reports with growing desperation. His staff calculated that the mobile fleet retained perhaps 100 operational aircraft, roughly one-third of the strength he had committed that morning. Worse, the quality of remaining pilots had deteriorated further because the more experienced aviators had led the raids and suffered disproportionate casualties. At 1,430 hours, Ozawa made a decision that reflected both courage and delusion: he would launch a fourth raid. 49 aircraft, representing nearly half his remaining strength, would attack the American fleet in late afternoon. The timing would force American fighters to return to their carriers at dusk, a dangerous evolution that often resulted in landing accidents. If Japanese aircraft could attack during the American recovery, they might achieve surprise. The theory was sound. The execution was doomed before it began. American radar detected the fourth raid at 1,450 hours. Fighter direction officers calculated that the Japanese would arrive at 1,600 hours, well before American fighters needed to recover. The Hellcats climbed to intercept with the casual confidence of pilots who had been destroying enemy aircraft all day and expected to continue doing so. The fourth raid met the same fate as its predecessors, but with an added element of tragedy that would become emblematic of Japanese aviation's collapse. Lieutenant Commander Toshio Fukuda, leading a squadron of Judy dive bombers, had been among Japan's most skilled aviators, a veteran of the China campaigns with over 1,000 hours of flight time. But his wingmen and the pilots following him were barely qualified to fly carrier operations, much less conduct combat missions. At 1,515 hours, Hellcats from USS Hornet intercepted Fukuda's formation. In the running battle that followed, Fukuda demonstrated the skill that had kept him alive through 3 years of war, violent maneuvers, sudden altitude changes, using cloud cover for concealment. He survived the initial attack that destroyed half his squadron. But when he looked for his wingmen, they were gone. The inexperienced pilots had scattered immediately under attack, most dying within seconds as they attempted maneuvers they had never practiced. Fukuda found himself alone, pursued by 4 Hellcats that coordinated their attacks with radio-directed precision. He extended every trick he knew, but the Americans didn't dogfight. They made high-speed passes, diving away when he turned, climbing back to altitude, attacking again. They were spending energy his aircraft couldn't match, fighting a three-dimensional battle he couldn't win. At 1,542 hours, a Hellcat's burst severed his Judy's hydraulic lines. The aircraft became progressively uncontrollable. At 1,547 hours, Fukuda ditched 70 miles from the nearest Japanese carrier. He survived the ditching, deployed his minimal life raft, and watched the sun set over the Pacific. No rescue aircraft came. No surface vessels searched. The mobile fleet, engaged in a fighting retreat, had no resources for pilot recovery. Fukuda died of exposure 3 days later, one of dozens of experienced Japanese aviators who survived combat only to perish because their navy couldn't recover them. The fourth raid lost 42 of 49 aircraft. 7 returned to their carriers, so badly shot up that 3 crashed on landing, killing their pilots. Of nearly 300 aircraft launched throughout the day, fewer than 50 survived. The mobile fleet's aviation capability had been effectively destroyed. But the Japanese nightmare wasn't over. At 1,600 hours, American search aircraft finally located Ozawa's retreating mobile fleet. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, faced a critical decision: launch a long-range strike against the Japanese carriers with the knowledge that his aircraft would have to return after dark, a notoriously dangerous operation that could result in significant losses from landing accidents. Spruance made the aggressive choice. At 1,621 hours, Task Force 58 launched 216 aircraft, Hellcats, Dauntless dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers, on a strike that would push the limits of their range. The pilots knew they were flying into twilight, that they would return in darkness, that some would run out of fuel before reaching their carriers. They launched anyway, driven by the opportunity to cripple Japanese carrier aviation permanently. The American strike arrived over the mobile fleet at 1840 hours, just as the sun touched the western horizon. What followed was a 20-minute melee that demonstrated American air superiority so absolute that even heavily defended carriers were virtually helpless. The few Japanese fighters that managed to launch, perhaps 35 aircraft from all carriers combined, were immediately engaged by escorting Hellcats and destroyed within minutes. With no fighter protection, the Japanese carriers faced dive bombers and torpedo planes attacking in coordinated waves that their anti-aircraft fire could not stop. The carrier Hayo took 2 torpedo hits at 1843 hours, exploded from aviation fuel vapor ignition at 1846 hours, and sank at 1902 hours. The carrier Zuikaku, the last surviving Pearl Harbor carrier, took multiple bomb hits that left her flight deck cratered and burning, though she remained afloat. The carrier Chiyoda took bomb damage that destroyed her ability to conduct flight operations. The oilers Genyo Maru and Seo Maru, critical for fleet refueling, were sunk. Several cruisers and destroyers took damage. In 20 minutes, American aircraft had accomplished what Japanese planners had believed impossible. They had crippled a carrier task force defended by multiple layers of anti-aircraft fire and combat air patrol. But the Americans paid a price for this success, though not from Japanese action. As the strike force turned east toward their carriers, now 300 miles away, the sun set completely. Aircraft began running out of fuel 100 miles from the fleet. Pilots faced the agonizing choice: ditch near other aircraft where they might be rescued together, or fly to fuel exhaustion hoping to get closer to the fleet. Between 2015 and 2100 hours, American aircraft began ditching across miles of dark Pacific. Some pilots made successful water landings and deployed life rafts. Others crashed on impact and were killed. Some descended too low while trying to conserve fuel and struck the water unexpectedly. The darkness that concealed them from Japanese forces also made rescue operations desperately difficult. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, made a decision that shocked his subordinates. He ordered every ship in the task force to turn on their lights, floodlights, searchlights, even truck lights on carrier decks, creating a beacon visible for 50 miles that would guide returning aircraft home. This violated every principle of naval operations in hostile waters. It made the fleet visible to any Japanese submarine or surface force in the area. But it saved lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The illuminated fleet became a magnet for returning American aircraft, but landing on carrier decks at night, with pilots exhausted from 4 hours of flight and combat, resulted in a cascading series of accidents that tested the limits of American damage control capabilities. Between 2045 and 2230 hours, Task Force 58 recovered aircraft in conditions that ranged from challenging to nearly impossible. Ensign Donald Lewis, flying an Avenger from USS Enterprise, approached his carrier with fuel gauges reading empty. His engine coughed twice as he entered the landing pattern, starved for the last drops of fuel. He dropped his tail hook and lined up on the illuminated deck, barely visible as a rectangle of light against the black ocean. His engine quit completely on final approach. The Avenger dropped, struck the ramp with its landing gear, bounced, caught the number 3 wire, and slammed onto the deck. Lewis climbed out on trembling legs to discover his fuel tanks contained less than 2 gallons, perhaps 90 seconds of flight time remaining. Not everyone was so fortunate. Lieutenant Robert Burnett, also flying an Avenger, ran out of fuel 3 miles from his carrier. He ditched successfully in darkness, deployed his life raft, and activated his emergency beacon. A destroyer picked him up 40 minutes later, cold and exhausted but alive. The pilot recovery systems that Americans had developed, emergency beacons, destroyer picket lines, searchlight-equipped rescue vessels, saved lives that would have been lost in any previous naval conflict. But some pilots were beyond rescue. Lieutenant Junior Grade Warren O'Mark's Hellcat, damaged by anti-aircraft fire during the strike, lost hydraulic pressure on approach to USS Yorktown. Without hydraulics, he had no flaps, no landing gear control, no tail hook. He circled the illuminated fleet, burning his last fuel, while deck crews frantically jury-rigged a barrier to catch him if he attempted a wheels-up landing. At 2,156 hours, his engine quit. O'Mark attempted to glide to the carrier deck but fell short, striking the water 200 yards astern. He was killed on impact. The night recovery resulted in 80 aircraft losses, 49 from fuel exhaustion and ditching, 31 from landing accidents. But of those 80 aircraft, rescue forces recovered 61 pilots and aircrew. The Americans had lost aircraft but preserved their most valuable resource: trained, experienced aviators who would fight again. The Japanese, who had lost similar numbers of aircraft throughout the day, had lost their pilots permanently, killed in combat, drowned after ditching, or dying of exposure because no rescue forces came. By midnight on June 19, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was effectively over. The Butcher's Bill revealed the magnitude of Japanese defeat: approximately 550 to 645 aircraft destroyed. Accounts vary, including operational losses, combat losses, and aircraft destroyed aboard sinking carriers. American losses totaled 123 aircraft, with 76 aircrew killed or missing. The exchange ratio exceeded 5 to 1 in aircraft, and far higher in terms of trained pilots. But numbers alone couldn't capture the qualitative destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The mobile fleet had embarked with approximately 430 carrier aircraft and 43,000 tons of operational carriers. After June 19, Ozawa commanded perhaps 35 operational aircraft and had lost 3 carriers sunk or crippled beyond repair. More critically, the cream of Japan's remaining experienced pilots had been killed. The aviators who survived were predominantly the least experienced, those who had turned back early, aborted missions, or simply gotten lost and never engaged. Admiral Ozawa's after-action report, recovered from Japanese archives after the war, acknowledged the magnitude of defeat with brutal honesty. American fighter direction exceeded anything we anticipated. Their radar-controlled interception gave them decisive advantage. Our pilots, inadequately trained, could not survive against their coordinated tactics. The loss of experienced aircrew cannot be replaced. The mobile fleet's offensive capability has been destroyed. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff received Ozawa's reports with mounting horror. They had gambled that Japanese spirit and tactical skill could overcome American material advantages. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot demonstrated that industrial capacity, technological superiority, and systematic training had made human courage irrelevant. Japanese pilots had fought with the same determination that had characterized their efforts since Pearl Harbor, but determination meant nothing when flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate training against an enemy who could see them coming from 100 miles away. The strategic implications were even more devastating than the tactical defeat. The Marianas operation, which the Japanese had hoped to disrupt, continued uninterrupted. American forces secured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, providing bases from which B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. The defensive perimeter that Japan had spent 3 years constructing had been irrevocably breached, and the naval aviation force that might have defended it had been annihilated in a single day. The days following the Turkey Shoot revealed the complete scope of Japanese naval aviation's destruction through a metric more telling than aircraft losses: pilot casualties. American intelligence, compiling data from multiple sources including intercepted communications, prisoner interrogations, and post-war Japanese records, calculated that the mobile fleet had lost approximately 90% of its carrier-qualified pilots in the battle and its immediate aftermath. This wasn't just a numerical loss, it was the extinction of institutional knowledge. The pilots who died on June 19, 1944, carried with them thousands of hours of collective experience, carrier landing techniques refined through years of practice, tactical innovations developed through trial and error, navigation skills honed across Pacific distances. This knowledge, painstakingly accumulated since the 1920s when Japan first developed carrier aviation, effectively died with them. The few Japanese aviators who survived faced a future without hope of reinforcement. Japan's pilot training pipeline, already inadequate before the battle, collapsed entirely in the following months. Fuel shortages meant student pilots received perhaps 50 hours of flight time before assignment to operational units, barely enough to take off and land, utterly insufficient for combat. American submarine warfare had strangled the petroleum supply lines that sustained both training and operations. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, one of the few experienced pilots to survive the Turkey Shoot, provided testimony to American interrogators after the war that revealed the psychological impact of the defeat. After June 19, we knew we could not win. The Americans had become invincible in the air. Our aircraft were obsolete, our pilots untrained, our tactics worthless. We continued fighting because surrender was unthinkable, but we fought without hope. The technological lessons of the Turkey Shoot influenced American naval aviation for decades. The integration of radar, fighter direction, and coordinated tactics became the foundation of carrier operations through the Cold War and beyond. The principle that information superiority, knowing where the enemy is before he knows where you are, provides decisive advantage became doctrine. Modern carrier battle groups with their layers of radar surveillance and networked combat systems trace their lineage directly to the combat information centers that controlled the Turkey Shoot. For Japan, the battle represented more than military defeat, it marked the end of their claims to technological or tactical parity with Western powers. The divine wind of kamikaze attacks, introduced later in 1944, was essentially an admission that conventional aerial combat had become impossible. When trained pilots flying modern aircraft couldn't achieve results, Japan turned to sacrificing untrained pilots and obsolete aircraft, trading lives for the mere possibility of inflicting damage. The contrast in naval aviation philosophy became stark in the battle's aftermath. The Americans treated pilots as valuable resources to be protected and preserved. Advanced aircraft design prioritized pilot survivability. Comprehensive rescue operations saved aviators who would fight again. Training pipelines produced pilots to industrial standards of quality and quantity. The entire system was designed for sustained operations across years of conflict. Japan had treated pilots as elite warriors whose individual skill could overcome material disadvantages. When those elite pilots died, the system that had created them couldn't replace them at scale. The spiritual emphasis on individual excellence had created superb aviators in peacetime but left no capacity for mass production when war consumed them. By mid-1944, Japan was sending pilots to their deaths with 100 hours of training because that was all the fuel economy could support. The submarines that sank Taiho and Shokaku demonstrated another American advantage, the integration of multiple warfare disciplines toward common objectives. Surface forces, aviation, and submarines operated with coordinated intelligence, shared communications, and unified command structures. The Japanese fought in stovepipes, their submarines, surface forces, and aviation rarely coordinated effectively, often didn't share intelligence, and sometimes didn't even know where friendly forces were operating. Post-war analysis by American naval historians identified the Turkey Shoot as the decisive moment when Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Subsequent battles, Leyte Gulf, the Philippines Campaign, Okinawa, featured Japanese aircraft attacking American forces, but these were desperate gestures rather than coordinated operations. The systematic, large-scale carrier operations that had characterized Japanese naval warfare from Pearl Harbor through mid-1944 ended on June 19, 1944. The human cost of the Turkey Shoot extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Thousands of young Japanese aviators died in the months following the battle, sent into combat with inadequate training and obsolete aircraft against an enemy who had achieved total air superiority. They died because their leadership couldn't accept that the technological and industrial gap had become unbridgeable, that courage and determination couldn't overcome radar, coordinated tactics, and superior aircraft. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.